Picture this. A lonely rancher wakes in the dead of night, his barn exploding into flames, animals screaming inside. He stumbles barefoot into the dirt, smoke choking his lungs, and there she island. The wife he married only yesterday, standing in the firelight with a torch in her hand, eyes cold, unreadable. He seizes her wrist, demanding answers, but she only whispers a single name he's never heard before. The question isn't just why she burned his world to the ground, it's who is coming next. Flames roared like a beast loosed from its cage, clawing up the timbers of the barn until the night itself glowed red. The poor rancher burst out of his cabin barefoot, the frozen dirt biting into his soles, his breath clouding in the icy air. For a heartbeat he thought it was lightning, some freak strike from the heavens. But the smell of kerosene cut through that hope, and the sight of his own barn crumbling under the weight of fire crushed him flat. Horses shrieked inside, a terrible chorus of hooves beating against wood. He staggered forward, arms flailing as if he might tear the inferno apart with bare hands, but the heat threw him back, singeing the hair on his arms, blistering the edge of his skin. Before we reveal the name whispered in the firelight, the riders who came to claim her, and the choice that would divide a town, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These aren't just stories of suspense, they're warnings etched in ash, and voices nearly smothered by smoke. Your support keeps these echoes alive. One click helps us build, remember, and speak the truths others would rather burn away. Thank you. Then he saw her. His new wife, his bride of a single night, stood 10 paces away, the torch still lit in her hand. The firelight painted her face in shifting gold and crimson, and though her eyes reflected the blaze, they revealed nothing of her soul. She did not cower, she did not run. She simply stared, calm as stone, while the barn collapsed in upon itself with a scream of falling timber. He choked on the smoke, shouting her name, a name he had only spoken aloud 3 times before, once at the vows, once at supper, once in the soft dark of the cabin when they lay side by side and he could not sleep. Now that name cracked in his throat, torn by betrayal and disbelief. Why? The word broke loose, torn from his chest louder than the wind that whipped sparks across the yard. She gave no answer. The torch in her hand sputtered, flame licking upward as if mocking the barn's ruin. She lowered it, slowly, deliberately, as though placing an offering at some invisible altar. Sparks leapt to the dry grass at her boots, but she did not move to stamp them out. He saw only her stillness, and it filled him with a dread deeper than the fire. Behind him, another cracked part of the roof caved in. A horse gave one last panicked scream before the sound was smothered in smoke. He fell to his knees, fists sinking into frozen mud. Years of labor, gone in a single breath. Every plank of that barn, hammered by his hands alone. Every animal fed through winters leaner than any man ought to endure. And she, this woman whose face he had not truly known until yesterday, stood as the author of his ruin. He pressed his forearm against his mouth, coughing hard, the bitter ash coating his tongue. In the roaring silence between the snaps of burning timber, a thought pounded in his skull. Was this vengeance? Was she an enemy sent under the cover of marriage? Or worse, had she simply chosen to destroy, without reason, without cause? Her gaze did not waver. At last she moved, only to tilt her head slightly, as though measuring the distance between them, gauging whether he would rise against her. A gust of wind drove the flames higher, scattering embers like fireflies. In that swirling red storm, her silhouette looked both fragile and terrible, like some lone sentinel watching the world burn. He wanted to rush her, to wrest the torch away, to demand the truth by force. Yet something in her composure froze him. Not fear, no, it was closer to recognition. As if she carried a secret larger than the barn, larger than both of them, and to touch her in that moment would shatter more than his livelihood. The barn's frame gave a final groan, then collapsed entirely, sending a pillar of sparks into the night sky. The light washed across the plains, stark against the endless dark, a beacon that surely could be seen for miles. He felt the weight of it, not just the ruin, but the call it would send out to strangers, neighbors, enemies alike. A fire like that was an announcement, and he knew in his bones that nothing in his life would remain hidden come dawn. He turned back to her, the torch in her grip flickered lower, a stub of flame fighting against the wind. At last she spoke, her voice low, unbroken, almost tender. "Now they'll come." The words struck him harder than the fire's heat. Not an apology, not a confession, a promise, or perhaps a warning. And as the last wall of his barn fell into glowing ruin, he realized the question that would haunt him until his final breath. Who, exactly, had he married? The plain stretched quiet and endless, the wind combing through tall yellow grass until it hissed like whispers from another world. The rancher sat on the porch of his cabin, boots planted firm, hat tipped low against the glare. His hands were rough, cracked by work, but it wasn't the cattle or the weather that left the deepest marks. The silence did. Every evening when the sun dropped and shadows grew long, the stillness pressed into him, reminding him of the empty chair at the table, the absence of laughter in the halls, the wide bed where no warmth lingered. When the letter came, carried by a dusty rider, he unfolded it with the kind of reverence a starving man reserves for bread. An offer, simple words on thin paper, that a widow from far-off country sought new shelter, a new bond. No introductions beyond name, no photograph. The terms were plain: a joining, a marriage of need more than love. He read it 3 times before setting it down, his thumb resting against the ink like it might vanish if he looked away. The decision did not come from romance. He told himself it was duty, land too wide for one man, chores too endless, nights too long. But beneath that, pulsing like a buried ember, was the ache of wanting someone to look him in the eye and see more than a solitary rancher with scars across his knuckles and silence in his chest. He wrote back his acceptance that night, his handwriting slow, deliberate, almost shy. When the answer came, arrangements were already set. She would arrive by cart 2 days hence. He spent the hours before her coming in a state of restless preparation. The cabin, usually a scatter of tools and dust, he scrubbed clean. He boiled water until steam filled the kitchen, scraped soot from the stove, patched a curtain that had hung in tatters for months. It all felt strange, like trying to disguise himself, like painting over a wound. Still, he worked, his body grateful for the distraction. On the second morning, he saddled his horse and rode out to the trail where the wagon would pass. He caught sight of it first by the dust plume rising against the flat horizon, slow and steady. His pulse hammered louder than the hoofbeats beneath him. When the wagon drew close, the driver gave a nod and halted. She stepped down, her boots striking the dirt with quiet certainty. The rancher's first sight of her was not of her face but of her hands, gloved in worn leather, clutching a small wooden box no bigger than a Bible. She lifted her eyes, then dark, steady, unreadable. Not defiant, not frightened, but carrying the kind of silence that made a man lean forward to catch what was not spoken. He offered his name, his hand. She gave hers with only a single word, soft but flat, as though spoken from a great distance. They rode together back to the cabin in silence, the wheels grinding over stone, the horse's breath misting in the cool air. Inside the cabin, she set her box on the table and did not open it. Supper passed with only the scrape of forks and the hiss of the lantern. He tried questions where she had come from, whether the journey was hard, but her answers came clipped, no longer than a breath. He wanted to press, to ask why she had sought him out, why she had come at all, but something in her eyes warned him away. When darkness fell, they lay side by side in the bed, strangers bound by vows spoken hours earlier. He stared at the rafters, listening to her even breathing, wondering whether this silence was simply the first stone of a wall that would always stand between them. Yet, in that quiet, Even uneasy as it was, he felt less alone. And for a man who had lived with nothing but echoes, that seemed reason enough. The first morning after she arrived, the air in the cabin carried a tension sharper than the cold. The woman moved through the rooms like a shadow, never quite meeting the rancher's eyes, never raising her voice beyond what was necessary. She kept her hands close to that wooden box, the one she had set on the table upon arrival, the one she never left out of sight. When she rose to pour water from the kettle, the box sat at her feet. When she stepped outside to draw breath, she carried it tucked beneath her arm. It was as though her very identity was locked inside it, and the thought of parting from it, even for a minute, filled her with dread. The ranch hand, a boy of 19 with sunburnt skin and a restless tongue, noticed it immediately. He leaned close to the rancher as they saddled horses, his voice pitched low. "She don't look at you when you speak. Don't look at nobody. And that box, what kind of woman brings nothing but that? There's something wrong, I tell you." The rancher shot him a hard glance, but the boy only shook his head, muttering, "Mark me, she's got secrets that'll cost you." The rancher said nothing. His silence was not agreement but a shield, a refusal to let suspicion take root before it was earned. He remembered the feel of her hand during their vows, steady but cold, the way her voice caught on her own name as if speaking it aloud was a wound. Whatever shadows she carried, they were hers to bear until she chose to share them. He knew loneliness well enough to recognize it in another, and if her silence was a wall, then he would not smash through it with suspicion. Yet unease lingered. At supper, she sat across from him, spoon poised above her bowl, answering his questions with words clipped short, never offering more than he asked. He tried warmth, a story of the colt born last spring, of how it had stood on trembling legs and bolted like a full-grown stallion before tumbling headfirst into the hay. It was a tale that usually coaxed a smile from anyone. She only nodded, eyes fixed on the rim of her bowl, as though the story was a language she could not translate. When the lamp was turned down low, he caught her watching the box. Not him, not the door, not the flame, but the box. Her gaze lingered on it with an intensity that unsettled him. He wondered if she feared it would vanish, or if she feared what would happen when it finally opened. Outside, the ranch hand whispered again, loud enough for the night to carry his words, "She's trouble." The rancher stood on the porch, arms crossed, the weight of those words pressing on him. He looked through the window at her silhouette bent slightly forward, her hand resting on the box as if drawing strength from it. Trouble, perhaps. But he saw something else too, something fragile, almost desperate. He thought of the barn he had built with his own hands, how every plank was first rough and splintered, shaped only with patience until it formed something whole. He decided he would treat her the same. Patience, not suspicion. Compassion, not judgment. Whatever secrets the box held, whatever silence she wrapped herself in, he would meet them not with anger but with steadiness. The boy might mutter all he liked, but the rancher knew this. A woman does not cross miles of empty land to a stranger's home for nothing. There was purpose in her coming, even if it remained hidden. And until that truth showed itself, he would bear the weight of her silence, as he bore the weight of his own scars. The evening meal was a quiet affair, but softer than those that had come before. The rancher had managed to coax a small rabbit from his traps, stewed it slow with onions until the fragrance filled the cabin. He set the pot between them, offering her the larger portion without remark. For the first time, she looked up and held his gaze, just long enough for him to see a flicker of something unguarded. Gratitude, maybe. Or the simple recognition that another human being had thought of her before himself. Her lips parted, as if she meant to speak more than a word. But what came was only, "Thank you." That moment lingered like a fragile flame. She ate slowly, her hands steady. And though the silence remained, it was no longer suffocating. He told her of a calf born 2 days before her arrival, how it staggered on its legs and refused to nurse until he warmed milk himself and fed it with a cloth. She listened, eyes lowered but intent, as though tucking the story away in some private chamber. When he laughed at his own clumsiness, she let out the smallest sound, a short exhale that might have been the ghost of a laugh. He noticed, and it lodged in him like a spark of hope. But the warmth of supper did not survive the night. Hours later, the rancher lay half asleep, the crackle of the dying fire the only sound in the room. Beside him, she turned restlessly, though whether she dreamed or fought some inner battle, he could not tell. Then came it, the faint scrape of boots outside, pacing across the hard earth. Slow, deliberate steps circling the house. His eyes snapped open, heart pounding. He sat up, straining to listen. The steps continued, pausing now and then, as though the prowler stopped to measure the distance to the door, or to peer in through a window. He reached for the rifle propped against the wall, fingers tight around the stock. The woman stirred. "What is it?" Her whisper was sharp but hushed, betraying more awareness than fear. He motioned for silence. The footsteps faded, then returned on the far side of the house. Whoever it was had no concern for stealth, they wanted to be heard. Then, as if the night itself had joined the conspiracy, a new sound cut through the dark, the rattle of her wooden box. It sat at the foot of the bed, untouched since evening. Yet now it shivered against the boards, a hollow clatter, as though something inside shifted, struggling to get free. His blood turned cold. She reached for it immediately, clutching it to her chest. Her arms tightened around it with a ferocity he had not seen in her before. Her body curved protectively over the lid. The rattling stopped, as if silenced by her touch. Her breath came fast, shallow, but she did not explain. The pacing outside ceased. Silence fell heavy, thicker than the dark itself. The rancher waited for the sound of retreating footsteps, the crunch of boots growing faint, but none came. Whoever circled the cabin remained unseen, watching, patient. He kept the rifle across his knees until dawn bled faint light into the cracks of the shutters. Only then did he hear a horse snort in the distance, the muffled jingle of reins, and at last, fading hoofbeats. The woman had not loosened her grip on the box the entire night. She sat upright now, pale, eyes wide and hollow. He searched her face for truth, for answers, but she turned away, as though ashamed of what he had witnessed. The warmth of supper felt like a memory from another life, burned away by shadows that no longer seemed content to remain outside. Something was closing in, and he knew with certainty the box was at the heart of it. The morning broke with a gray light, the kind that promised neither warmth nor relief. Frost clung to the grass, crunching under the rancher's boots as he crossed the yard to check the stock. He had barely reached the fence when the smell hit him, not the sweet must of hay or the damp of soil, but something acrid and wrong. Smoke. He spun toward the barn just as a tongue of flame licked out between the boards, greedy and fast, swelling higher with every gulp of dry timber. He shouted, the sound raw in his throat, and sprinted toward the blaze. The horses inside screamed, hooves pounding in blind panic, rattling the stalls. He yanked at the doors, but the heat drove him back, singeing the hair on his arms, the skin on his cheeks. His eyes watered, blinding him with smoke, but through the blur he saw her. She stood a few yards off, torch still burning in her hand. Her face was calm, too calm, as if she watched not destruction but inevitability. In that frozen second, his heart split between disbelief and fury. "Why?" He roared over the crackle of collapsing beams, his voice ripped raw by the fire's roar. "Why would you do this?" She didn't answer. Her eyes met his, and something in them held him in place, more binding than any rope. He lunged forward, seizing her wrist with a grip like iron, dragging the torch down between them. The flame flickered dangerously close, illuminating every line of her face, every shadow beneath her eyes. Still she did not flinch. The barn groaned, a terrible sound of timbers failing under their own weight. Sparks shot into the sky, 1,000 fireflies swarming against the pale dawn. The rancher felt the ground tremble as the roof buckled, and then the structure folded inward with a crash that echoed across the plains. His life's work, years of sweat and bone, fell into ash before his eyes. He tightened his grip, shaking her arm as if answers might tumble out like loose nails from a box. She only breathed, her lips barely parting, and then she whispered a name. A single word, soft but certain, carried on the smoke. He froze. The name meant nothing to him, no family he knew, no neighbor, no friend. Yet she spoke it with the intimacy of someone calling a ghost back from the grave. Confusion raged in him hotter than the fire. "Who?" he demanded, but she only repeated the name, this time more faint, like a prayer she alone could understand. Her gaze flicked toward the horizon, as if expecting someone to rise out of the smoke and answer her call. Behind them, the last wall of the barn crumbled, and with it, the animals' cries were swallowed by silence. The torch slipped from her hand, extinguished in the dirt, but her wrist remained steady in his grip, her pulse calm against his fingers. She did not resist, did not plead. It was as if the inferno had burned fear clean out of her. Neighbors would see the smoke soon. Riders would come, questions sharp as knives. But in that moment, with his barn reduced to embers, and the woman he had married only days ago staring past him into some unseen distance, the rancher felt the weight of something larger pressing down. The fire was only the beginning. The name she had spoken was the spark of a truth that had not yet revealed itself, and it chilled him deeper than the loss of everything he owned. He released her wrist slowly, though the imprint of her still seemed carved into his palm. The flames hissed and cracked behind them, but the greater blaze had already taken root in his chest. The gnawing, relentless need to understand what this woman had brought into his life, and what ghosts were coming to claim her. They brought her into town like a prisoner, though no rope bound her wrists. The fire's smoke had drawn neighbors from miles, men and women wrapped in coats against the cold, their eyes hard as they stared at the rancher and his bride. Word spread faster than truth ever could. Whispers that she had set the blaze, that she'd meant to ruin him, that she was some hidden agent of an old feud. The rancher walked beside her, jaw tight, suit still clinging to his clothes, the smell of burned wood trailing him like a shroud. Every step toward the meeting hall felt like another nail driven into the coffin of his life's work. Inside, the benches filled quickly. Faces he'd known for years now seemed carved from stone. The town elder, a man whose voice carried the weight of judgment, stood at the front and called for order. "Your barn is ash," he said, fixing the rancher with a cold stare. "We are told your wife was seen with the torch. What defense have you?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some demanded she be cast out immediately. Others muttered about harsher punishments. The ranch hand, nervous and pale, spoke too quickly. "I saw her with it. She didn't even hide it. She watched the barn burn." The boy's words hung in the air like smoke, feeding the crowd's hunger for condemnation. The rancher rose, voice unsteady at first. "I saw her too. But I also saw something else." He swallowed hard, meeting their eyes one by one. "I saw no fear in her, no malice either. She spoke a name I don't know. There's more to this than the fire." A woman from the back scoffed. "What more do you need? Fire is fire. The barn is gone. Could have been all our barns next." He felt their judgment pressing on him, heavy as the night sky, yet he would not bend. "I've worked beside most of you, traded with you, buried kin in the same earth. You know me. You know I don't take to foolishness. But I won't condemn her without truth. A torch in her hand don't explain the why." The elder narrowed his eyes. "Then what do you believe she is? An enemy sent to starve us? A pawn used to lead destruction here? Or a victim?" His voice sharpened. in whose hands the fire still killed stock and stole livelihood? The question cut like a blade. The rancher looked at her, this woman he'd taken in, whose silence weighed heavier than chains. She sat still, box in her lap, face pale but unbroken. He wished she would speak, wished she would give them anything to hold against the tide of suspicion. But she offered nothing. Only that same calm that had both unnerved and steadied him. "I believe," he said slowly, "that she came here with reason. That reason ain't yet known. But I'll not see her hanged on guesses, not while I breathe." His voice cracked, but he pressed on. "If we throw out every stranger who carries secrets, then none of us are safe. Not a one. We all have shadows." The hall fell into restless mutters, sides forming like cracks in ice. Some nodded, uneasy but swayed by his conviction. Others glared, unmoved, calling for justice to be swift and harsh. The elder raised a hand, silencing them. "Then we wait," he said. "Proof will come. Until then, she stays under watch. But know this, if harm comes to any of us, the blame will rest on your shoulders, rancher." The verdict was no true acquittal, only a stay of execution. Still, the rancher stood straighter. He had not saved her, not yet, but he had kept the mob from swallowing her whole. As they left the hall, whispers trailed them like wolves. He knew the fire had not ended with ash. It had only shifted into suspicion, and the flames of that burned colder than any blaze. The night after the town's judgment, the cabin sat under a silence that felt sharper than any blade. The rancher sat at the table, his hands clasped, staring at the grain of the wood as though he could read answers there. Across from him, she held the small box close, fingers wrapped tight around it, her knuckles pale in the lantern light. For days it had been a silent companion, the center of every suspicion, the thing she guarded more fiercely than her own breath. Tonight, the weight of it seemed unbearable. He finally broke the stillness. "If you want me to stand with you, I need to know what's inside." His voice was low, stripped of accusation, but it carried the iron of resolve. "Secrets don't burn barns by themselves. If there's truth, then show it." For a long time she didn't move. Her eyes flickered toward the door, then back to the box, as though she expected someone to burst in and snatch it away. At last, she nodded, small and hesitant. She slid the latch open. The hinges groaned, dry with age, and the lid lifted with a sound like a sigh. Inside lay a locket, tarnished but intact, bearing the insignia of a soldier's regiment. Next to it were several folded papers, their edges charred as if torn from fire. The rancher leaned closer, his pulse quickening. He reached for the locket, but she pulled it back with sudden urgency, clutching it to her chest. Her voice cracked when she spoke, though it was the longest string of words he had yet heard from her. "My husband wore this," she whispered. "Not you. Another man. He fought under that banner, and he died under it. But not before he sent word that men were coming, hunting what he carried, hunting me because I had it." Her fingers trembled as she held up the letters. "These are what's left, orders, names, proof of betrayal among them. He gave them to me with his last breath." The rancher stared at the blackened paper, at the half-vanished words still clinging stubbornly to the page. The truth was plain. These were not keepsakes of love but documents that could topple men if read by the right eyes. She lowered her head, her hair falling like a curtain across her face. "The barn was not your enemy. The barn was a hiding place. I knew they would search it first. I burned it so they would find nothing. Better ash than capture." Her voice hardened as she lifted her eyes to his, and for the first time, he saw fire in her that was not born of torches. "If they take these papers, more than your land will fall. Whole towns, whole families." The rancher felt the ground shift beneath him. He thought of the men who had circled his cabin, the deliberate steps in the night, the unseen eyes watching. They were not after cattle or coin. They were after her and the box she carried. He let out a breath, heavy and slow, as the reality of it settled into his bones. So the fire was to protect, to keep them blind. She nodded. Tears glimmered in her eyes but did not fall. I never meant to ruin you. I meant to save what I could, even if it meant destroying the only shelter I had left. The rancher leaned back, staring at the low flame of the lantern. The barn was gone, his stock scattered or dead, and suspicion hung over him like smoke. Yet here, in her trembling hands, lay proof that their trouble was not born of madness or cruelty, but of war and betrayal that stretched far beyond the borders of his land. He reached across the table and set his calloused hand lightly over hers. The locket and letters remained between them, fragile as glass, dangerous as powder. Then we'll face them together, he said, though his voice carried the weight of a vow he wasn't sure he could keep. The box sat open, its secrets no longer locked away, and in that moment he knew the fire that had devoured his barn was only the first spark of a greater blaze racing toward them. Dawn came restless, with a red sky stretched thin over the horizon like a wound. The rancher had scarcely closed his eyes when the first sound of hooves rolled through the valley. At first it was distant, a low murmur like thunder on the plains. But it grew, multiplied, until the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of approaching riders. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, and saw the dust rising where the road bent toward town. They were coming fast, too many to mistake for travelers or merchants. This was a war party. By the time he and his wife reached the square, half the town had already gathered, drawn by the growing clamor. The riders stormed in, a column of dark figures on tall horses, weapons glinting, faces obscured by scarves and brimmed hats. Their leader dismounted first, a man with a scar running from temple to jaw, eyes sharp and merciless. He wasted no time on pleasantries. His voice carried over the crowd, loud enough for all to hear. "We know she's here," he barked, pointing a gloved hand at the woman. "Give her to us, and no one else needs to burn." A chill swept through the gathered townsfolk. The rancher felt their gazes shift between him, the woman at his side, and the armed men who outnumbered them 10-1. Fear moved like a ripple in water, and with it came something uglier: calculation. The town elder stepped forward, his voice trembling though he tried to steady it. "What claim do you have on her?" The scarred man laughed, a sound with no mirth in it. "Claim enough. She carries what belongs to us. Hand her over, and we ride out. Resist, and we'll salt this place to the ground." His words were as cold and final as a death sentence. The ranch hand, pale as chalk, hissed at the rancher under his breath. "They'll kill us all for her. Don't be a fool. Give her up." The rancher's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the men who waited with rifles across their saddles. He thought of the barn collapsing into ash, of the locket and letters that still lay hidden in his cabin, of the truth she had shared in the fragile hours of night. She had not come to ruin him, but ruin had followed her all the same. Whispers rose around him, neighbors debating in harsh tones, some demanding she be surrendered, others wavering in uneasy silence. The fragile thread of community frayed before his eyes. These were people he had worked beside, traded with, mourned with, and now their loyalty wavered under the weight of fear. She stood silent at his side, box clutched close, her face pale but steady. He saw in her eyes not surprise but grim acceptance. She had expected this. She had always known they would come. The rancher lifted his voice, rough with smoke and fatigue. "You want her, you'll have to go through me." The words fell heavy into the air, and a silence followed, sharp as the pause before lightning strikes. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The town elder's face darkened. "You'd put us all in the line of fire for her? For a stranger you barely know?" "She's under my roof," the rancher shot back. "That makes her mine to protect. You turn her over now, you'll have more than my barn in flames. They'll keep coming, and next time it'll be your houses, your children." The scarred man's grin widened, teeth flashing like a wolf's. He signaled to his men, who fanned out, their rifles angling low, ready. The crowd shifted uneasily, some stepping back, others pressing closer, their fear turning to desperate defiance. The square became a powder keg, breath held, waiting for the spark. And in the center stood the rancher and his bride, bound not by love's tender growth but by fire, suspicion, and the weight of secrets too heavy for one town to bear. The riders demanded blood. The neighbors demanded answers. And as the sky cracked with the sound of a distant gun being cocked, the rancher knew there was no path left but through the storm. The town square reeked of gunpowder and smoke long after the last shot had cracked the air. Dust hung in a haze, drifting down to settle on the sprawled bodies of men who had ridden in with fire in their eyes and left with nothing but silence. Horses stamped nervously at the edge of the street, reins abandoned, the echo of chaos still trembling through their flanks. Neighbors stood frozen, half in awe, half in terror, their whispers muted beneath the ringing in every ear. Judgment had come swiftly, and blood had watered the ground. The rancher stood at the center of it all, rifle hanging loose at his side, his face drawn and weary. Beside him, she clutched the wooden box against her chest, the locket and letters inside untouched by the violence that had nearly claimed them both. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, her hair dusted with ash, but her eyes were clear, clearer than he had ever seen them. She had faced the storm, and though the town still looked at her with suspicion, none could deny she had stood her ground. The elder, voice cracked and broken, declared what all had already seen. The riders were no mere bandits. They had come for what she carried, and they had been willing to burn the town to ash for it. Whatever secrets those papers contained, they were larger than any one homestead, larger even than this valley. The elder's judgment was grim but final. She was to remain, for if she left unguarded, the storm would follow her trail. And so the weight fell, as it always did, upon the rancher's shoulders. He looked at her then, not as stranger, not as burden, but as partner bound by the fire they had survived together. Every eye in the square watched, waiting for him to renounce her, to cast her aside and reclaim the fragile piece of suspicion. Instead, he lifted his hand rough, scarred, still trembling, and placed it lightly over hers where it gripped the box. "She stays," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "She stays, and she is mine to protect." The words cut through the murmurs, silencing the crowd. Some shook their heads, others turned away, unwilling to share his risk. But no one stepped forward to oppose him. The town had seen the riders fall, had seen the fire consume his barn, and still he stood beside her. That was judgment enough. Days later, the embers of the barn cooled to black rubble. The rancher and his bride stood among the ruins, tools in hand, the smell of char still clinging to the earth. He set the first post upright, shoulders straining, while she held it steady with quiet strength. The work was slow, heavy, and endless, but it was theirs. In the gray sky above, clouds dragged low, threatening more rain, but the two of them did not falter. Every beam raised was an oath, every nail driven a promise that they would not bow to the shadows pressing at their borders. The land bore scars now, just as he did, and just as she did. But from those scars grew resolve. They would rebuild, not just the barn, but something more fragile and dangerous. Trust. And as the camera lingers on their figures beneath that vast and darkened sky, ash smearing their hands, sweat streaking their faces, the narrator's voice folds into the silence. Would you have stood with her, or turned her away?